The invitation had sounded exciting when it first arrived. A high-profile gathering, filled with people who mattered, the kind of place where reputations were built and connections decided futures. He had been eager from the start, already imagining the conversations, the opportunities, the way he would finally be seen. She agreed to go for him, not because she needed the room, but because she believed in standing beside the person you choose, even when the space doesn't feel like yours. As they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The glow of chandeliers reflected off polished floors, soft music blended with low conversations, and every detail whispered exclusivity. Guests moved with confidence, dressed in sharp suits and elegant gowns, each one carrying a presence that felt practiced. She walked calmly beside him, her posture relaxed, her expression steady. She didn't try to match the room. She didn't need to, but he did. From the moment they entered, he became more alert, more aware of every glance, every subtle reaction. His shoulders straightened, his voice adjusted, even his smile felt more calculated. He greeted people quickly, introducing himself with energy, making sure to mention the right details about his work, his achievements, anything that would place him in the right light. And when it came time to introduce her, there was a brief pause, just long enough to be noticed. "This is my wife," he said, his tone lighter, almost casual. No detail, no pride, just a label. She noticed it, but she didn't react. They moved deeper into the room, joining small circles of conversation. Names were exchanged, hands were shaken, and questions came naturally. "What do you do? Where are you from? What do?" Names were exchanged, hands were shaken. "What brings you here?" When someone turned to her with genuine curiosity, she opened her mouth to answer, but before she could finish her first sentence, he stepped in. "Keeps things simple," he said with a soft laugh, as if it was something charming. A few people smiled politely. One person nodded. The conversation shifted away from her almost instantly. She felt the moment pass, but she didn't chase it. Instead, she stood there composed, her eyes quietly observing everything. The room, the people, the way respect moved differently depending on who claimed it and who waited for it. She didn't need to speak to understand what was happening, but he kept going. With every new group, the pattern repeated. He spoke more, she spoke less, and when she did try to join in, he found ways to redirect attention back to himself. It wasn't obvious enough to be called out, but it was clear enough to be felt. At one point, someone complimented her calm presence, saying it was rare in a room like this. She offered a small, polite smile, but before she could respond, he laughed again. "She's still getting used to this kind of environment," he said. "It's not really her scene." The words hung in the air for a second. Not harsh, not loud, but sharp enough to carry meaning. She didn't correct him, not because he was right, but because she understood something he didn't, that the way someone speaks about you in a room full of people says more about them than it ever will about you. Around them, the night continued. Conversations flowed, glasses clinked, laughter filled the space. Something subtle had already shifted, and he didn't even realize it yet. As the evening moved forward, the energy of the room grew louder, more confident. Conversations deepened, laughter became easier, and people settled into the comfort of being surrounded by others who looked, spoke, and carried themselves in a familiar way. He was starting to feel it. The more he talked, the more relaxed he became, as if the room was finally accepting him. But in that comfort, something else started to slip. They stood with a small group near the center of the hall. The lighting was brighter, and the attention naturally followed. Someone shared a story about a recent business deal. Another added a comment about travel and connections, and the conversation flowed. When it shifted toward personal lives, someone turned to him with a friendly smile. "And your wife?" they asked. "What does she enjoy?" It was a simple question, an open moment she was ready to answer. But he spoke first. "Oh, she prefers staying out of all this," he said, gesturing lightly around the room. "Quiet life, you know." A few people nodded, but there was a subtle glance exchanged between them. Not judgment exactly, but curiosity. Something didn't quite match. She stood there calm, letting the moment pass without interruption. She didn't rush to correct him. She didn't need to. But he didn't stop there. "Honestly," he continued with a light chuckle, "this kind of crowd can be a bit overwhelming if you're not used to it." This time, the laughter was softer. Not everyone joined in. A few people looked at her instead, trying to read her reaction. She met their eyes briefly, then looked away, her expression unchanged. The discomfort wasn't loud. It didn't take over the room. But it was there, just beneath the surface. He didn't notice. Or maybe he chose not to. Because in his mind, he was doing what he thought he needed to do, aligning himself with the room, proving he belonged, and somehow, He believed that distancing himself from her made that easier. They moved again, from one conversation to another. Pattern repeated, each comment a little sharper than the last, each remark carrying a quiet dismissal wrapped in humor. It wasn't aggressive, it was subtle, but over time subtle things build. At one point, someone complimented her again, this time on her composure. "You seem very grounded," they said, genuinely. Before she could respond, he smiled. "She balances things out," he replied. "Balances things out. Someone has to." It sounded harmless, almost like praise, but the tone behind it told a different story. She felt it, and so did a few others. The room hadn't turned against him, but it had begun to watch more closely. People were noticing not just what he said, but how often he spoke over her, how easily he redirected attention. Comfortable, he seemed placing himself above her in small, quiet ways. She remained steady, not reacting, not correcting, just present, because she understood something deeper. That respect forced into a room doesn't last, but the truth always finds its way in. And as the night continued, that truth was getting closer, closer than he realized. By the time the evening reached its peak, the room felt full, not just with people, but with attention. Conversations had grown louder, movements more relaxed, and the earlier tension had blended into the background. But beneath it all, something remained, a quiet awareness that hadn't fully disappeared. He, on the other hand, felt more confident than ever. Standing near the center of the hall, surrounded by a few guests who seemed engaged in what he was saying, he leaned into the moment. His voice carried just enough to be heard beyond his circle, his posture open, his expressions animated. It was clear he believed he had finally found his place in the room, and once again she stood beside him, calm, composed, silent. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she had chosen not to compete for space that didn't need to be taken by force. Her presence remained steady, almost effortless, in contrast to the energy he was projecting. Then came another moment. Someone asked a light question about how long they had been married. It should have been simple, a shared answer, a shared memory, but instead, he laughed softly and said, "Long enough to know we're very different people." The group smiled politely, waiting for more. "She's not really into all this," he added, gesturing again to the room. "Different world." The words landed a little heavier this time. There was a brief pause, just enough for the shift to be felt. One of the guests glanced at her, as if expecting her to respond, to correct him, to say something that would balance the conversation. Didn't. She simply held her posture, her expression calm, her eyes steady. And that silence spoke louder than anything he had said. A few people in the group exchanged quick looks, subtle but noticeable, the kind of reaction that doesn't interrupt a moment, but quietly changes how it's perceived. The laughter didn't come as easily this time. The conversation didn't flow as smoothly. Still, he continued. "Sometimes I feel like I have to translate things for her," he joked lightly. Different perspectives. It was meant to sound playful, but now, the tone had shifted. It no longer felt like humor, purpur, tessiture. It felt like something else, and people noticed. Not everyone reacted openly, no one challenged him directly, but the room was no longer responding the same way. There was a distance now, a subtle pulling back. The kind that happens when something doesn't sit right, even if no one says it out loud. Odors, Farawal the prom, she noticed it too. But she didn't change. She didn't rush to fix the moment. Didn't try to reclaim attention or correct the narrative, because she understood something he still didn't, that the more he spoke, the clearer things became. Across the room, a few guests began to shift their focus elsewhere. Conversation started to move away, not abruptly, but naturally. The energy around him, once growing, began to thin, and yet he kept talking, unaware that the room had already begun to answer him without saying a single word. Just as the silence around him started to feel noticeable, something else began to change. The entrance doors opened. Quietly, but enough to draw attention, and this time, the shift was impossible to ignore. Chapter 10 Wubai chapters. The moment the doors opened, the energy in the room shifted in a way that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't loud, there was no announcement, no dramatic entrance, but conversations slowed, then paused. Heads turned almost in unison, as if the room itself recognized something important had just arrived. A man stepped inside, walking with quiet confidence. His presence wasn't forced, it didn't demand attention, yet it commanded it effortlessly. The kind of presence that doesn't need introduction because the room already understands. A few guests straightened their posture. Others adjusted their tone mid-conversation. Some simply watched. He noticed it. First, he thought it was just another important guest, someone influential, someone worth acknowledging. He glanced briefly, then returned to his conversation, trying to maintain his momentum. But the attention in the room didn't return with him. It stayed at the entrance, and slowly he realized something wasn't right. People were no longer focused on him. A small circle around him had thinned, their attention pulled elsewhere. Even the ones still standing nearby seemed distracted, their eyes shifting past him. He turned again, this time more fully. The man was moving through the room now, greeted with quiet respect. No exaggerated reactions, no loud greetings, just subtle acknowledgement, a nod here, a handshake there. It was clear without being spoken. This wasn't just another guest, this was someone who mattered. For the first time that night, he felt uncertain. He glanced around, trying to read the room, trying to understand what he might have missed. And then, without realizing it, his eyes followed the direction everyone else had already noticed. She had seen him, before anyone else reacted, before the room adjusted. Her expression had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but enough to be felt. Her posture remained the same, her composure intact, but there was recognition there, familiarity. A quiet shift that didn't match the way she had been standing all night. He noticed it immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his voice lower now, less certain than before. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the man as he moved closer, step by step, closing the distance without hesitation. The space around him opened naturally, people making room without being asked. Conversations didn't stop completely, but they softened, adjusted, aware of his presence. Then she spoke, calmly. "He's here." Just 2 words, but the way she said them carried something he couldn't place. Confusion flickered across his face. "You know him?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual, but the question came out tighter than he expected. This time, she looked at him, and for the first time that night, there was something different in her expression. Not hurt, not frustration, certainty. Before he could ask anything else, the man reached them, and when he stopped in front of her, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, because whatever was about to happen next was about to change everything. The man stopped in front of her, his presence calm but undeniable. Up close, the quiet authority he carried felt even stronger. Conversations around them faded into the background, not completely silent but distant enough that every small movement here seemed louder. He met his gaze without hesitation. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. Then, without any rush, he gave a small nod, not formal, not distant, familiar. "You made it," he said. Her expression softened slightly. The first real shift anyone had seen from her all night. "I did," she replied, her voice steady. The man beside her, her husband, stood still, trying to process what he was seeing, the tone, the recognition, the ease between them. None of it matched the story he had been telling all evening. He forced a polite smile, stepping slightly forward. "It's good to meet you," he said, extending his hand. The man looked at him briefly, acknowledging the gesture with a short nod. Woofer 4 is full, but his attention returned to her almost immediately. "I was wondering when you'd arrive," he continued, his voice calm. "I had a feeling you wouldn't miss this." There was no need for explanation, no introduction offered, and that more than anything shifted the balance in the room. A few guests nearby began to recognize the situation. Their expressions changed subtly. The same people who had listened to his jokes earlier were now watching closely, piecing things together without a word being spoken. He lowered his hand slowly, the smile fading just enough to show uncertainty. "You didn't tell me," he started, his voice quieter. Now she turned to him, her gaze steady. "You didn't ask," she replied. The words weren't sharp, they didn't need to be. A silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full of realization. The man beside her finally shifted his attention back toward him, this time more directly. "You've had her standing here all evening," he said, his tone calm, but firm. "And yet you chose not to see her." There was no accusation in his voice, just truth, the kind that doesn't need to be raised to be heard. Around them, the room had fully changed. The earlier laughter, the light conversations, the quiet judgments, all replaced with attention that felt different now. More aware, more honest. He glanced around, noticing it for the first time. The same people who had once nodded along were now watching him differently. Not impressed, not entertained, just seeing. "Didn't mean," he began, but the words didn't carry the same confidence they had before. She didn't interrupt him, she didn't need to, because the moment had already said everything. The man placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture that carried weight without effort. "Come," he said quietly. She nodded once, and as she stepped forward beside him, the space around them shifted again. Not because of status, not because of wealth, but because of something much simpler, respect. She didn't look back. Not out of anger, not out of anger, not out of pride, but because she had already understood something he was only beginning to realize, that who you stand beside matters, and how you treat them matters even more.